Hello and welcome to Lecture 2. This lecture will provide a brief historical overview of the institutional development of the judicial branch, and especially of the Supreme Court in the United States. George Washington quite clearly placed a high value on the establishment of the judiciary as an essential component of democracy in America, writing, "Impressed with the conviction that the due administration of justice is the firmest pillar of good government, I have considered the first arrangement of the judicial department as essential to the happiness of our country and to the stability of its political system." Indeed, if you were to read that quote without context, it would be easy to assume that the court has always played a central or starring role in the American political system. However, as we shall see, that has not always been the case. In fact, the court had a bit of a rocky beginning, only gradually evolving into the well-respected, legitimate political institution that we are so familiar with today. In today's lecture, we'll consider why Washington's vision of an important and strong judicial branch took so long to come to fruition. In it, we'll address 6 questions. First, we'll very quickly trace the establishment of the third branch of government during the Constitutional Convention and the subsequent adoption of the U.S. Constitution. Then we'll move to consider the ambiguity of Article 3 of the Constitution, which established the federal judiciary, to think about why the creation of the court system is not self-enacting. More specifically, we'll look at the Judiciary Act of 1789, which really established the judicial branch and makes a starring appearance in Marbury v. Madison, a case from 1803 that we'll walk through in great detail. But before we get to that, we'll take a detour to consider why it was so hard to get justices to serve on the Supreme Court by looking at the practice of something called circuit riding. We'll discuss the implications that this practice had on the court's legitimacy. And then we'll spend the meat of today's lecture walking through Marbury v. Madison, which is arguably the most important case in all of judicial history. Because this case is so vital, and because its background story is simply entertaining, we'll get into the nitty-gritty details of the case. Don't worry though, I won't ask you to recount all of the minutiae on course assessments. You should simply listen to the story and understand how and why Marbury v. Madison has had such a lasting impact on the federal judiciary. We'll end the lecture by tracing the institutional development of the Supreme Court by looking at its physical presence in our nation's capital. To consider the evolution of the judiciary, let's rewind the clock all the way back to the foundations of our country at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia. There's actually very little to report in terms of debate with regards to establishing a judiciary at the Constitutional Convention. The biggest point of contention among the founders was whether or not to have lower courts. Interestingly enough, the seeds of judicial review can be found in the debates, and there is ultimately very little doubt that the framers intended for the court to have judicial review, which allows the courts, the Supreme Court and all the federal courts, to invalidate acts of the executive and or the legislative branches if it conflicts with what the Constitution says. The Anti-Federalist Brutus letters, in fact, fixate upon judicial review as a weakness of the Constitution and use that as an argument against ratification. Yet we know that the Anti-Federalists failed and the Constitution was ratified. Article 3 of the Constitution establishes the existence of one Supreme Court and such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. As an interesting point of trivia, there are a grand total of 375 words about the judiciary in the Constitution. On the other hand, the establishment of the executive branch in Article 2 gets 1,023 words, and Article 1, that establishes Congress, gets 2,265 words. But the major takeaway here is that in order for there to be a federal judiciary, for it to come into existence, Congress actually had to do something. Without its action, the third branch of government simply would not exist. So that's what Congress did. Indeed, in one of the very first acts of the very first Congress was to pass the Judiciary Act of 1789 to put the Constitution into practice. The Judiciary Act of 1789 created the federal court system, which contained a Supreme Court with 6 justices and 2 types of lower courts. District courts, which act as the trial courts in the federal system. There were 13 total courts for 11 states, and intermediary appellate courts, known as circuit courts. Initially, Congress did not create actual judgeships or seats for the circuit courts, so there were no circuit court judges. When circuit courts had to meet, a district court judge and 2 Supreme Court justices would have to get together to sit on that intermediary appellate court called the circuit court. The Judiciary Act also established the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction over state cases involving federal statutes or state laws and practices that violate federal law or the Constitution. It also tried to modify the court's original jurisdiction, which gave rise to Marbury v. Madison, which is a point that we'll return to shortly. As president, Washington was cognizant of the importance of the judiciary. In picking a nominee, he would write, "I have thought it my duty to nominate for the high offices in the judicial department such men as I conceived would give dignity and luster to our national character." Despite Washington's respect for the judiciary, the court was regarded as impotent, and filling those 6 seats on the Supreme Court was a massive challenge. For example, John Jay, the first Chief Justice, accepted work as an ambassador when he was serving as the Chief Justice, which was a clear violation of the separation of powers, and then Jay ultimately resigned to become the governor of New York. Alexander Hamilton declined to replace Jay, citing anxiety to renew his law practice and political activities in New York, which he obviously held in higher esteem than the Supreme Court of the United States. As a further example of the court's ill repute, Justice John Rutledge actually quit the Supreme Court to become the Chief Justice of the Southern Court of Common Pleas, which is just a very basic state court in South Carolina. So why was the Supreme Court such a bad job anyway? A key reason that the court lacked appeal was because of a practice called circuit riding. Since the Judiciary Act of 1789 did not create any circuit court judges, the Supreme Court justices that had to serve in that capacity along with district court judges. So what does it mean to ride circuit? It means traveling in a carriage or on horseback for 1,000 to 2,000 miles twice a year. Can you imagine how painful that would be? None of the earliest justices, including Justice Iredell, who you see here, were fans of traipsing all over the country a couple times a year. You can see that the first 5 circuit courts were all along the eastern seaboard, as far north as New Jersey and as far south as North Carolina. Continue to listen to the job description in the justice's own words, and then decide if you would be willing to sign up for the job of a Supreme Court justice. The first Supreme Court justices, like Justice Woodbury, were not shy in voicing their complaints about the agony of circuit riding. While he suffered from what we'd think of as car sickness today, riding in a stagecoach for a couple thousand miles, the justices also had to put up with inclement weather, extreme heat and cold. Woodbury's further details his suffering, writing, "I've been elbowed by old women, jammed by young ones, suffocated by cigar smoke, sickened by the vapors of bitters and whiskey, my head knocked through the carriage top by careless drivers, and my toes trod into a jelly by unheeding passengers." In other words, when you stop for a rest, you're staying in a dodgy inn with a dozen or so strangers above a tavern, some of whom might be tempted to jump into bed with you. And for all of this, you earned the 2009 equivalent of $79,000. Today, justices make about $250,000. The Chief Justice makes slightly more than that. So you're not poor working for the Supreme Court, but you certainly aren't making nearly as much money as you could make in private practice. The other problem with circuit riding is that it diminishes the court's own reputation. You serve with a district court judge as the intermediary appeals on a case. So that's after the district court heard it, and then it's appealed to the next level. So you hear it there, and you have to issue a ruling, but then you might have to rule it on it again at the Supreme Court if the party from the appellate level decides to appeal it to the Supreme Court. So basically, it created some different strategic incentives for the justices that were having to ride circuit to try to dispose of cases at that level so that they wouldn't get appealed to the Supreme Court, so they didn't have to hear the same case twice where their colleagues might overturn the decision that they made at the lower level. It really wasn't until Marbury v. Madison in 1803 that the court started to gain some traction as a reputable and legitimate political institution. In this foundational case, the Supreme Court finds itself squaring off with both Congress and the President. To emerge unscathed and in such a way to preserve, or rather establish, the authority of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Marshall engages in some pretty impressive political maneuvering. The case marks the first time that the Supreme Court exercises the process of judicial review. Because this case is commonly considered the most important written opinion in the Supreme Court's history, and because it marks the first use of judicial power, we are going to go through it in detail. First, let's set the stage. These three guys on your screen, they're the key players for now. So listen to this crazy, totally true story. Again, there's a lot going on, but you won't be accountable for all the teeny tiny details. In the first post-Washington election in 1796, the political parties were not especially well organized. So while there was a bit of contestation between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the two parties that existed in the 1790s, the parties were not yet very well organized in every state, and neither party had really developed a discernible platform. By the election of 1800, this all changes. In 1796, Adams barely beat Jefferson, winning the presidency by a narrow 3 electoral college votes, which, according to the electoral rules in place at the time, made Jefferson the vice president. By this point, of course, Adams and Jefferson are opponents to one another, so you can imagine the uneasy relationship between the president and his vice president. Adams' Federalists wanted a strong central government, while the Democratic Republicans of Jefferson's party want a simple federation of states bound together by common interests like trade. This leads to a lot of infighting and partisan bickering. As the party platforms were established, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which prohibited false, scandalous, or malicious writings against the government, were used as a political tool for Federalists to put Democratic Republicans in jail. Then the Federalists lost Congress, and it seemed pretty clear that they would lose the presidency as well. In fact, Thomas Jefferson devised a plan. Instead of just challenging President Adams to the presidential election, he tapped Aaron Burr to run as his running mate so that they together could defeat John Adams, so that satisfying the electoral rules, Jefferson would win the election, and then the second place loser would be Aaron Burr, who could become his vice president instead of Adams losing and becoming Jefferson's vice president. So trying to avoid what we had in the election just 4 years prior. So although Jefferson ran as the main opponent, in a very strange twist of fate, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, again both Democratic Republicans, wound up with a tie in the Electoral College, which sent the vote to the House of Representatives. At this point in history, the Electoral College was divided in such a way that each state received a single vote, but there were different party delegation sizes within each of the 16 states. It wasn't until the 36th round of voting in the House that the tie between Jefferson and Burr is broken through some various promises and back-scratching deals that Jefferson made with members of Congress. But eventually Jefferson wins and becomes president, and Burr his vice president. After knowing that he's been defeated, Adams receives a letter from Oliver Ellsworth, the current Chief Justice. Ellsworth had been acting as a diplomat abroad for the last year, which was really common. And Ellsworth writes to Adams to say that he's sick and he can't travel back to the United States. So President Adams nominates John Jay, the first Chief Justice, to resume his position on the court. Remember, Jay had resigned earlier to run for governor of New York. Jay rejects the nomination, feigning health, but the real reason was that he believed that the court was weak and he had no desire to go back to the Capitol. So at that point, Adams nominates his Secretary of State, John Marshall, instead. Marshall had served as an aide to General George Washington during the Revolutionary War, and it was the first justice to have formal legal training. He went to law school at William and Mary, and he'd previously been elected as a member of the House of Representatives. Marshall is described as being a Clinton-esque politician, in the sense that he's very good at working with people, and he's pleasant to be around. The one notable exception, however, is that Marshall hates Jefferson, and Jefferson hates Marshall, who happens to be his second cousin once removed. So that's pretty notable, right? That Adams is picking someone who everybody likes, except for the incoming President Jefferson, who just defeated Adams. So you know that this pick was a way for Adams to needle Jefferson. But Marshall's nomination angered the Federalists, interestingly enough, so Adams' own party, because the high Federalists feared that Marshall was too moderate, that he wasn't pure enough. The moderate Federalists were on board, but there was a wing of the Federalist Party that were disappointed that Adams didn't pick someone more ideologically extreme. The Democratic Republicans are actually fairly neutral about the nomination. In the end, the Federalist opponents swallow their criticisms out of fear of who might be nominated instead, and Marshall is unanimously confirmed by the Senate. Marshall quickly makes a few notable changes to the court. First, he changes the dress code, bringing in plain robes to replace ornate ones. Prior to his reign as Chief Justice, all of the justices on the Supreme Court followed the English tradition, and they wore those massive wigs and really ornate decorative robes that you might be familiar with from the English legal system. Second, in a case called Talbot v. Seaman, decided in 1801, Chief Justice Marshall demanded that the court start speaking with a single unanimous voice, writing just one opinion, getting rid of the separate seriatim opinions that dominated the court for its first decade. So prior to Chief Justice's leadership, when the court heard a case, every justice in the case wrote an opinion. That caused a lot of confusion, right? Because then if anyone wanted to see what the Supreme Court decided on a case, they had to read all 6 opinions and try to find commonalities in the law to see what it was that the majority of the court thought. So Marshall got rid of that altogether and said, we aren't going to have any sort of separate opinions at all. We're going to speak with a single unanimous opinion. Third, Marshall brought all of the justices together under one roof. Justice Story, who served under Chief Justice Marshall, remarked, "We take our dinner together and discuss at the table the questions which are argued before us. We are great ascetics and even deny ourselves wine except in wet weather, but look to the window and ask if it's raining. If it's sunny, then Marshall says, all the better. Our jurisdiction extends over so large a territory that the doctrine of chance makes it certain that it must be raining somewhere." Now, funny little anecdote aside, what I am simply trying to emphasize here is that Chief Justice Marshall did a lot to establish collegiality on the court, to bring the justices together under one roof so that they were dining together, they were drinking wine together, they were talking about the cases together, and then they were working together to produce a single decision and a single opinion in every single case. Okay, back to the story. So, recall that the Federalists lost control of both Congress and the presidency. This is roughly to a regime change within a dictatorship at this point. The lame duck Federalists, who at this point are still in control of Congress and the presidency, but they've lost. So Congress is changing hands, the presidency is going to the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson's leadership. And so there's this period of time where the Federalists are serving as lame ducks, and they want to do as much as humanly possible to install their political allies into positions of power before leaving town. Making Marshall the Chief Justice is one of those key appointments. This type of strategy is alive and well today, by the way. Its modern incarnation is maybe even more sinister, something called recess appointments. Presidents can even bypass Congress to make temporary appointments to the government. Presidents are about 50 times more likely to make recess appointments after losing an election than they are during a non-election year. So this type of history of trying to put your political allies into power when you're on your way out is something that has existed since our nation's inception and continues into the modern era. Okay, again, back to the story. So Adams makes a whole slew of nominations to various positions during February of 1801. And then, on February 27, 1801, which is a Friday, the act concerning the District of Columbia becomes law and creates a bunch of patronage posts within D.C., including a number of justices of the peace. The duties of justices of the peace are pretty minor. They essentially resolve only minor violations of a monetary value under $20. So it's not a lucrative position by any means, but it provides a launching pad for political careers. In fact, Thomas Jefferson had been one. On Monday, March 2, Adams submits 42 nominations for Justice of the Peace posts to the Senate, including one for a man named William Marbury. On Monday and Tuesday, the lame duck Senate confirms the nominations and the commissions are signed by both Adams and Marshall, who is still acting as Secretary of State at this point. On the evening of March 3rd, all new commissions need to be delivered. Marshall normally has a couple of clerks to help him, but he's loaned them out to help incoming President Jefferson with the presidential transition. So John Marshall, again, who's the Secretary of State under Adams, not yet the Supreme Court Chief Justice, asks his brother James to come help him as Secretary of State to deliver these commissions. But some of them just don't get delivered. Jefferson visits the State Department soon after inauguration. He sees those remaining commissions sitting on the table, and he forbids their delivery. At first, it seems like nothing much is going to happen in response to Jefferson's refusal to deliver the commissions. All is quiet from March to December of 1801 as Jefferson prepares to deliver his first State of the Union address. But then, on December 16 or 17, 1801, William Marbury, who had been nominated and confirmed for a Justice of the Peace position and who had never received his commission, filed a suit against James Madison, who is Jefferson's Secretary of State. Remember, it's the job of the Secretary of State to deliver the commissions. Importantly, Marbury requests something called a writ of mandamus, which literally means we command. A writ of mandamus is a judicial order for somebody to do something. On December 18, the court orders Secretary of State Madison to show cause for why William Marbury should not receive his commission, and it schedules oral argument for the case to be heard in June of 1802. Jefferson's position is one of noncompliance. He refuses to provide an argument, both in the initial and final hearing of the case, as to the government's position. His message? We don't care what the court says. Congress responds to the court's order, too, by repealing the Judiciary Act of 1801, which had created 16 new circuit court judgeships, eliminating the justices' need to ride circuit. But Congress then passed the Judiciary Act of 1802, rescheduling the Supreme Court's term, which in effect totally eliminated the term that the court was currently serving on, and Marbury has to be rescheduled because it can't even be heard in June of that year. So the court finally hears the case in February 1803 after a couple of false starts due to delays in various justices returning to D.C. Jefferson still refuses to make an argument on behalf of his actions, but the case proceeds without him. When Marbury v. Madison is finally resolved, Chief Justice John Marshall answers three distinct questions. First, does Marbury have a right to the commission? Second, if he does, is there any available remedy? And third, if a remedy exists, is it a writ of mandamus? It is in his answers to these questions that Marshall displays his political ingenuity. As to the first question, does Marbury have a right to a commission? Yes, argues Marshall. The real question is, when does the executive power over a non-removable appointee cease to exist? The last thing required by the executive is his signature. Thus, after that happens, it's out of his hands. So everything that President Adams did, even though he was a lame duck president, was completely constitutional. He followed the letter of the Constitution. He made an appointment. It was confirmed by the Senate. He signed that appointment, which made it a lifetime tenurable position under Article 3 of the Constitution. So Marshall and the court conclude that Jefferson breaks the law by prohibiting the commission's delivery. That this is not a political appointee that an incoming president has any control over because it's a constitutional appointment. So that's a pretty clear rebuke of the Jefferson administration. So the next question is there a remedy? The key dividing line is whether this is an executive political decision beyond the court's power, or rather a specific action related to a constitutional responsibility of the president. While the decision of whom to nominate is an executive decision, once that decision has been made, the appointee is entitled to his or her term. So the court says yes, there has to be some sort of legal remedy in order to counteract future administrations from trying to pull these types of politics over these constitutional appointments. But the court knows that they're in a really tricky spot, right? Jefferson has taken a position of non-compliance the entire time. The court is such a weak political entity. So even though the first part of the opinion in Marbury versus Madison is such a strong rebuke of the Jefferson administration, they can't stop there, right? Marshall knows that if they just say, this is a constitutional appointment, Jefferson, you have to give Marbury his job, Madison, you have to deliver that commission, that Jefferson and Madison simply won't do it. So the court adds a third question, whether or not the remedy is a writ of mandamus. And here's where the Constitution comes in. So the Constitution says, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction in all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and councils, and those in which a state shall be a party. In all other cases, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction. The Judiciary Act of 1789, the basis of Marbury's suit, gives the court the power to issue writs of mandamus to persons holding office under the authority of the United States as a trial court, with no requirement of first seeking relief from a lower court. In his opinion, Marshall deftly sidesteps the political controversy by invalidating this component of the Judiciary Act of 1789, declaring it an unconstitutional extension of the court's authority. In short, Congress did not have the authority to increase the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court beyond what is carefully, explicitly articulated in the Constitution. By invalidating an act of Congress, the Supreme Court exercised judicial review for the first time. So the answer is no. The writ of mandamus is not an appropriate remedy because it's an unconstitutional way to bring a case to the Supreme Court in the first place. Strikingly, this argument is Marshall's own. There's no record of this argument made at any point in the case's history, from when it was filed in December 1801 through the arguments made in February 1803. No questions from the bench during oral arguments, no Democratic-Republican advocacy of the position at all. Nothing. It's pretty rare for a justice to introduce an entirely new argument into an issued opinion. Marbury had a profound impact on the development of the political system in the United States. First, it established constitutional supremacy, noting that the Constitution forms the fundamental and paramount law of the nation, and consequently, an act of the legislature repugnant to the Constitution is void. Second, it established the Supreme Court as the appropriate body to interpret and apply the Constitution, arguing that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. And third, it established judicial legitimacy in scores of other cases that pitted the court against other branches of government, like in Brown versus Board of Education and U.S. versus Nixon, these highly salient, politically contentious cases. One clear way to see Marbury's lasting influence on the legal system in the United States is to look at the treatment of Marbury as establishing relevant precedent. So precedent is what the courts cite as authority in making future decisions. This graph reveals case citation patterns by the Supreme Court. In other words, the graph shows that most Supreme Court cases never receive a single mention in future Supreme Court considerations, so their precedential value is very low. Indeed, the modal category here is 0, and it drops precipitously from there. Notice that Marbury versus Madison, on the other hand, has been cited more than 200 times by other Supreme Court cases, holding fourth-place honors. Moreover, Marbury has been cited more than 90,000 times by circuit court opinions, and almost 130,000 times by district court opinions. It should be clear that Marbury versus Madison had a significant role in giving the court power, and a lot of that is credited to Chief Justice John Marshall. But recall that Congress ultimately has tremendous power over the court. Beyond the power of judicial review, another key component to the court's power comes from its independence from the other branches of government. This was a long and hard battle for the Supreme Court to win. For example, in 1805, the Democratic Republicans attempted to remove Justice Samuel Chase through impeachment proceedings. Impeachment of a judge or justice requires high crimes and misdemeanors. But Chase's impeachment was purely political. The Democratic Republicans simply didn't like Chase's ideological persuasion. Senator William Giles, one of Chase's contemporaries, said, "We want your offices for the purpose of giving them to men who will fill them better." Fortunately, Congress wisened up and Chase was acquitted during the trial. This proved to be really significant because it, in part, secured the future of an independent judiciary. Judges cannot be removed from office for only political reasons. Beyond impeachment, Congress also has the power to change the number of seats on the court. For example, under the Federalist-controlled Congress, the Judiciary Act of 1801 reduced the size of the court on the eve of the Democratic-Republicans' takeover, with the goal of preventing the Democratic-Republicans from packing the court. In general, 5 is the smallest potential number for the Supreme Court, but it has grown as large as 10 justices in 1863. It fell to 9 justices in 1869, where it's remained ever since. We'll talk much more about this in a later lecture this semester when we talk about FDR's court packing plan, but the fixed number of justices has been another factor in establishing judicial independence over the past couple of centuries. Congress has also had an impact on the court's agenda-setting process and its ability to exercise discretion in the cases that come before it. We'll talk a lot more about this later this semester, but for now you should note that Congress incrementally and gradually deferred authority to the Supreme Court. And we see that as it did so, the Supreme Court secured a more legitimate, authoritative place in American government. Okay, so as a quick recap, with its fledgling beginning at the end of the 18th century, the court was off to a rocky start. The judiciary garnered little respect, and those who were qualified to act as Supreme Court justices frequently opted to either not serve on the court at all or leave the court for more lucrative positions in other branches of government or in the private sector. However, by the start of the 19th century, under the watchful eye of Chief Justice John Marshall, the court began to rapidly gain power. As it developed, the court has evolved into a well-established institution that is central to American democracy. While several factors contribute to its institutional development, like autonomy from the other branches of government, the establishment of internal norms, and so forth, perhaps the most visible manifestation of the court's institutionalization is the development of what we call the Marble Palace, which is the Supreme Court's own building. The center of government was established in Washington, D.C. in 1800, but nobody remembered to give the court a place to meet. So from 1800 to 1810, the court bounced around within the Capitol building. Then from 1810 to 1860, the court met in a random room in the Capitol, which is now called the Old Supreme Court Chamber. Then from 1860 to 1935, the court met in what is formerly the Senate's chamber when the Senate got to upgrade. And in 1929, Chief Justice William Howard Taft, and you should recognize his name because Taft was a former president and then he became a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but Taft successfully lobbied for a new separate building for the court in 1929. The building initially cost $9.7 million, which if we adjust it to today's dollars, it would be about $125 million. But interestingly enough, the building actually ran under budget due to deflation because of the Great Depression. So the building opened finally in 1935, where the Supreme Court meets now. And it's really interesting, I think, to take a quick look at some of the features on the Supreme Court's building. Featured on the main sculpture group are Chief Justice Taft, the building's architect, and Chief Justice Hughes, who is responsible for overseeing the building after Taft dies, and, notably, Chief Justice John Marshall. Just a small bit of trivia, the Solicitor General and the Vice President are the only two positions in government that have offices in buildings for other branches. The Vice President has an office in the Senate and in the White House, in the Executive Building, and the Solicitor General has offices in the Supreme Court and the Executive Building, which is a point that, again, we'll come back to later this semester. As the court developed as an institution, it has also gone through distinct eras. For example, in the first half of the 19th century, federalism cases dominated the Supreme Court's agenda before giving way to economic regulation concerns in the latter half of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. The mid-20th century saw sweeping changes to the court's agenda as it focused on the development of civil rights and liberties. As the historical development of the Supreme Court demonstrates, the judiciary is a dynamic and evolving part of the political system that has been shaped by the other branches of government and that has exerted tremendous influence over the development of the executive and legislative branches. Beyond the Supreme Court, there are also state courts and lower courts within the federal system. These courts aren't unimportant, but all lack the ability to set national legal policy, which is why we focus so much on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is, generally speaking, the only appellate court with a discretionary docket. This means the court itself gets to decide what cases it will hear. Throughout history, the size and scope of the federal judiciary has grown as the population and territory of the United States has grown. In the federal judicial system, recall that there are two tiers, circuit courts and district courts. The United States Court of Appeals, which are also called circuit courts, consists of 13 separate circuits that contain seats for 179 authorized judges. It sits below the Supreme Court as the intermediate tier on the hierarchy. Most of these circuit courts are arranged geographically. So you see here that there are 11 circuit courts, all organized across the United States. Michigan is part of the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. A 12th geographical circuit court is the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, which sits in the nation's capital. There's also a specialized Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals, that is not geographical. It hears specialized cases, and that also sits in Washington, D.C. At the bottom of the hierarchy sit the main trial courts in the federal system, which are United States district courts. There are 94 district courts in the Union that have 679 authorized judgeships. We'll talk a little bit more about the role of these courts in the judicial process later this semester. That concludes the historical overview of the Supreme Court. If you've mastered the material in this lecture, you should be able to explain the points on this review slide. Thank you, as always, for your careful attention today.